When people think of natural carbon removal methods, they often think about trees. That makes sense that that's the first thing that comes to mind because a ton of countries have prioritized planting them. So much so that it would actually be pretty much impossible to plant as many as countries rely on to make up for the emissions they want to keep spewing out. It turns out that restoring and conserving other ecosystems like wetlands and grasslands might be a more effective way to reduce emissions. It also tackles another ecological crisis we're facing, biodiversity crisis. While still very much underexplored, more countries are coming around to this reality. Locally to me in Central California, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, recently allocated $2.2 million towards restoring part of Elkhorn Slough in an effort to protect this biodiverse ecosystem from sea level rise. I decided to use this as a case study for looking at how these important ecosystems can be restored and why it's important to do so. To learn more about the project, I spoke with Dave Felice and Monique Fountain from the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate change and the clean energy transition. If those are important topics to you, please hit the subscribe button below and ring the bell so you don't miss every time I post. Okay, let's start with what the Elkhorn Slough is. A slough is another name for a marshy area. So me being me, I had to look further into it because I wasn't sure the difference between marshes, bogs, and swamps. Apparently, those are three different types of wetlands. Wetlands are low-lying areas saturated with water either seasonally or permanently. This could be saltwater, freshwater, or a bit of both, aka brackish water. The Elkhorn Slough is a marsh wetland, meaning it's mostly made of grasses with a few trees. The base of this wetland is Pickle Weed. It is also an estuary, meaning it is where the river meets the ocean, in this case the Salinas River. So some of the slough is brackish water and some is saltwater. It is also called a tidal marsh because it floods and drains with the ocean tides. All this is to say I can use slough, wetland, marsh, and estuary all interchangeably in this video. Elkhorn Slough is located in Central California, as I mentioned earlier, and has the largest salt marshes outside of San Francisco Bay. It's known for its diverse selection of animals, including more than 340 birds, 550 marine invertebrates, and 102 fish species.
Another thing about Elkhorn Slough is it is also home to the greatest concentration of sea otters in California. Hello, I am JJ over on Ecotasia, and I am here to briefly tell you about how these marine mammals are actually important allies in climate mitigation. Sea otters have a major impact on ecosystems they inhabit, particularly the highly productive kelp forests of the Pacific coast, like those out in the ocean just beyond the slough in the rich marine ecosystems of Monterey Bay. Sea otters are of great benefit to kelp forests because they love to eat tasty sea urchin, which feed on the holdfasts of kelp and destroy these forests, which is really unfortunate as healthy kelp forests are really great at sequestering carbon, taking millions of tons of atmospheric carbon into the deep each year. To learn more about sea otters and ways wetlands are important in climate change adaptation and mitigation, visit my channel and check out my video on the subject.
Thanks, JJ. Check out Ecotasia's video after this one because they'll cover more wetland examples. Back to the Elkhorn Slough though. The marsh has changed a lot over the years and experienced many stressors, from agriculture production and runoff to development to climate change induced sea level rise. In fact, only about half of the original slough still survives to this day, which is better off than most of California's wetlands. The state has lost more than 90% of its original wetlands. Without intervention, the rest will be submerged by sea level rise in the next 50 years. That's why this project is so important. The Elkhorn Slough Restoration Project will raise and restore 120 acres of tidal marshes, which represents about 12% of the marshes remaining. The project is being funded by grants from NOAA and many other groups, including the California Coastal Conservancy and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program. Here's Dave Felice explaining more about the project's goals.
When these marshes are isolated from the tidal waters, then they tend to dry out and sink and drop in elevation. So we call that subsidence. And so when subsidence occurs, then we need to rebuild that marsh plain up to an elevation that will sustain salt marsh. Because right now the elevation is too low to grow any salt marsh plants. And so we end up with a fairly non-productive mudflat. And so we're trying to get back that vital habitat of tidal marsh. And the project also looks forward at where we think the ocean will be in the future in terms of elevation. And so we've built this marsh especially high so that it can withstand some of that change in elevation.
As you can hear, there was a lot of wind, and unfortunately I wasn't prepared for that equipment rise, which was a complete dumb blonde moment. So I'll go back and forth between paraphrasing and supplementing what was said in the interviews and sections of the interview itself. Thank you again, Monique and Dave, for taking the time to talk with me about this important project. Managing the wetland is complicated because 15 different agencies have jurisdiction over the water body. So there's a committee made up of a representative from each of those agencies.
And we want their decisions to be based on the best available science. And so we have scientists from all different areas, so, biologists, hydrologists, geologists, from the whole spectrum. It's very interdisciplinary. And they helped us to identify some of the data gaps and then also to work through the ecological trade-offs that there are. Because even though an area has been really degraded, it's still serving a benefit for something. And so there could be an ecological trade-off when you go to restore that or change that habitat type. And so we kind of work through all of that. And that is how we came to the decision that this type of a project, this type of restoration was really important. It's a small enough system that we can really make a meaningful change in the system. So that group is what led us to this project. It was the most prioritized project along with marsh research, that we've been doing a lot of research to learn about carbon sequestration and how marsh is restored in an area like this.
So before we go into more about what raising up a tidal marsh looks like, let's talk about the carbon sequestration aspect. Carbon sequestration is a fancy term for removing carbon from the atmosphere. As I mentioned earlier, ecosystems like wetlands and grasslands do a better job of this than forests. Despite these ecosystems only covering about 3% of the Earth's surface, they hold about 30% of land-based carbon, according to a 2017 study. Coastal wetlands have been estimated to sequester carbon 55 times faster than rainforests. Here's Monique explaining why they're so good at this.
So salt marshes do an excellent job of sequestering carbon, better even than forests, planting trees, because those forests will eventually die and degrade, and that system will be, that carbon then in that tree will be released back into the system. Here in the slough, so this is blue carbon, which is the carbon stored in coastal ecosystems. And so what happens is that where sediment is trapped and the marsh continues to grow, all those roots are sequestered, basically compacted underneath, and that's that nice peat you get underneath.
The grasses will eventually form layers of this peat with trapped carbon underneath, which can stay there as long as the ecosystem survives. Sea level rise causes tides to slowly chip away at the peat layers, releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere. So not only would sea level rise kill the carbon sequestering ecosystem itself, but it would also release some of the progress made back into the atmosphere. It's like a double whammy.
It's a little difficult to see from where we're standing, but there's a tidal channel out there that's full of pickle weed, and the top of the marsh is a little bit bare. And that's because we built the marsh very high in the tidal system in order for it to still be here through sea level rise.
Specifically, they've accumulated over 500,000 cubic yards of dirt from a retired farmland to raise the tidal marsh 2 to 3 feet. And then they rely on some volunteers to help replant the area. They expect it'll be high enough to withstand 100 years of sea level rise based on moderate projections. This creates a harsher environment for the pickleweed though, because it grows faster in the tidal marsh. And because it's growing slower, it means it takes up carbon also at a slower rate. But on the other hand, if the project managers kept the pickleweed where it grows faster, it wouldn't survive as long into the future. This is an example of weighing the long-term and short-term benefits. Monique expressed concern about future projects that strictly focus on carbon sequestration potential because it can be tempting to go for the short-term high uptake potential rather than preparing an ecosystem for long-term survival.
Because if we built a lower marsh out here, we might lose it in 30 years, even though it would vegetate right away and look really great. So we're really glad that we built it high, but it's definitely a trade-off. Keep in mind, very important to conserve our marshes, but even in conserving our marshes, we'll have some loss of blue carbon function.
That's just one of the trade-offs projects like this have to contend with. A lot of ecosystem restoration is trial and error paired with continuous learning about how the unique plant and animals function together. It's also looking at historical maps of the area from when the marsh was previously in balance. Dave mentioned that they found a 1930s photo showing what the marsh looked like to kind of use it as a blueprint for restoration. But at the end of the day, the final goal is to get the place to where humans don't have to constantly go in and tinker with it.
When we talk about restoration, and we talk about it in terms of putting habitat back to the way it was. But what we're really looking at here is restoring natural processes. So we're not restoring the system to any point in time particularly. What we're doing is we're rebalancing it, because we don't want to always be out here tinkering with it. We want it to be rebalanced, to be self-sustaining.
That way, it can keep storing and taking up carbon for generations while providing a home for many important plants and animals. I said that the US was beginning to understand the importance of preserving things like wetlands, but that's only partially true. Recently, the Supreme Court voted to considerably narrow the definition of a federally protected wetland, meaning that wetlands in states that don't understand their importance are now at major risk. Now that you understand how maintaining wetlands can help fight climate change, and if you want to learn further information about that subject, remember to check out Ecotasia's video on the topic too. Keep an eye on any wetland or grassland near you to make sure it doesn't get developed to death. These ecosystems need a loud voice, and that's our job. Some ways to do this are what I always say at the end of each video. Talk about the climate crisis every single day and support your local news organizations. Leave a comment down below letting me know if there's any wetlands near you or what you might have learned from this video. Thank you so much to the people on Patreon who help support me and my fur baby Rue. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous David H., Norman Anal, Greg H., Paul B., Phil Plasma, Dan Morton, Nate, Specker, Bree C., climate teacher John J., Deanne, Steve, Kevin Morton, and SKP Joe Korsgold. I greatly appreciate your support of $5 or more. If you would like to support the Beckosphere, please check out the Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links in the description below for reoccurring or one-time payments. Bye for now.